Hello and welcome to this video on history and possibly kind of bad history. Not quite History Channel levels of crazy wrong, but definitely trying to get there. We are of course talking about the 10 plagues of biblical Egypt. The 10 plagues of Egypt are described in the book of Exodus, chapters 7 to 12. Really bad Hallmark and other after-school special religious group movies, and a few, let's say, attempts by larger studios such as Disney and Paramount. And no matter the studio, for that matter, source, they all follow the same pattern, or perhaps we should say script. It goes from water being turned into blood, followed by frogs, frogs followed by lice, or possibly gnats, then flies, a plague that kills livestock, boils, and not the kind that describes water, but the skin diseases, hail, locusts, darkness, and finally the death of the firstborn of any non-Israelite family. This is of course a great content for a movie, but is it real, and what evidence exists for this series of very unexpected events to have happened? More so, how would they happen if it is actually possible? Some of this is much easier to explain than others, but there are actually decent explanations for some of the plagues. Of course, we need to actually assume that the answers are less mystical and more realistic for those explanations to work. Otherwise, the answer is simply God did it, and God is great for filling gaps in knowledge, and not so great for actually explaining things. Starting with the first of the plagues, because kinda makes sense to start at the start. Turning water into blood. Unless there was some disturbing levels of downstream massacre that turned the water into blood, there's actually a decent explanation that is less macabre. An algae bloom. Red algae blooms are not a form of a special gay event, rather it is an event where a small organism called Pfiesteria piscidia grows out of control. Now, this could either be the algae bloom, or possibly alternatively it could have been volcanic silt. Both of these would have turned the water red and also kill all the fish, as is seen in some more recent environmental disasters. Effectively the same result, red water. The only difference is that in red algae blooms it's somewhat more toxic. In the form of volcanic silt, it can be dangerous, but less so, let's say. Similarly natural in origin is the Weyerhaeuser for frogs, lice, flies, and locusts. These are all typically caused by some sort of ecological imbalance. For example, the volcanic silt in the water, or even just the algae bloom by itself, could have triggered mass migration of frogs, insects, and more. This includes obviously locusts, and all of this is well documented in Egyptian history. So, easier to explain, let's say. The lice, less so, but certainly entirely possible that that's simply an unfortunately timed expansion in the population of lice or fleas. Flies, well, as things die, for example, fish in the river, Nile, you would have a certain amount of denial at first, but also, flies breed on dead things. Locusts looking for food, because they tend to migrate around a lot, and, well, to a certain extent, frogs would run away from the damaged water streams they would otherwise have been in, but also chasing the flies. So, all of these things are reasonably easy to place into history from a purely, let's say, realistic sense. Less easy to explain, but still possible, is the plague of boils. There are very well documented, let's call them epidemics, of anthrax, smallpox, and more that occurred in Egypt, and this could have explained the plague of boils. The only catch here is the degree to which it spread. This would either have to be in a particularly virulent strain, or there had to be some really terrible screw-up by somebody. Even less likely, or at least less easy to explain, but still possible, are the plagues of darkness and hail. We do have at least one explanation, that being volcanic activity. The Thera eruption 1600 BCE would be a good cause for both the hail-like ashfall and the darkened skies, simply due to the volcanic plume and the ash cloud that comes from it. The last plague that killed all the firstborn is the most challenging, but an explanation of sorts exists, but it is much more tenuous, and that is, for all intents and purposes, selective malnutrition or poisoning. This sounds morbid, and it kind of is, but there are things that will grow in foods that would commonly be fed to children, for example, mycotoxins in grain. This is more commonly seen in the modern world in things like, say, peanut butter or other peanut products, where mycotoxins occur due to mold getting into the, peanut, obviously. Because there may have been a, let's say, practice at the time of giving food as a first priority to the oldest child, or the firstborn, they would have been disproportionately affected, simply because they would have received most of the dose of the mycotoxin or whatever else it was that happened to be poisoning them. Or possibly if there was a, let's say, food deprivation scenario. For example, all of your workers suddenly ran away to go sit in the desert for 40 years, suddenly you might have starving people, and they would therefore be malnourished. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. When we talk about this, we need to say that there is limited evidence for most of the events. Not all of them, but pretty much all of them. Most of them. We, of course, don't count the Book of Exodus, as it is literally a giant fairy tale that is used to justify the existence of a higher being, wandering in the desert as a crazy person for 40 years, and hoping that the giant imaginary person does not spank you for being in the desert and not doing what you were told to do, except that you built a giant bull. Anyway, we're getting sidetracked. What evidence does directly exist to substantiate the 10 plagues of Egypt? Now, we do have, admittedly, non-contemporaneous evidence of the Nile turning red. Egyptian records, like the Admonitions of Ibwer, which is a Middle Kingdom text, describe chaos because the river turned red, the red is blood, and some have made an argument that this parallels the plagues. The caveat to this is that the whole thing is unrelated to the 10 plagues of Egypt, and it predates when Exodus is supposed to have happened, meaning that we're basically able to say that there are previous examples of it occurring, but not necessarily that it did happen at the time. Archaeological evidence is a little bit better in some ways. We had the Thera eruption mentioned earlier. This occurred from 1600 to 1500 BCE, and is generally attributed as a possible, if not potential, trigger for environmental anomalies resembling the plagues. The ash clouds and layers are a pretty big thing to darken the sky, and kind of obvious. But also it can cause climate disruptions, for example, a famine due to the lack of sunlight and therefore crops not growing as well as they otherwise should. And there are various other, let's say, similar problems that the eruption would have caused that have been documented in archaeology. Far more nebulous is the evidence, let's say, for parts of the Nile just being abandoned. Now, this is evidence in support of there being a loss of population, but what's important here is that we have evidence of rapid Nile Delta abandonment in certain periods, and this could align with parts of Exodus. But the important thing here is that nobody seems to have a good solid agreement on exactly when these timelines should line up, and so there is a lot of, let's say, debate, argument, philosophy in the case of those particular people who are so inclined as to whether or not this is actually relevant to the Israelite exodus from Egypt. For example, though, we do have a period such as where Hyksos was abandoned in roughly 1550 BCE. The evidence against the 10 plagues is rather more mixed, and the problem is that the evidence very much against it that is solid is much more solid. And, well, we also have an issue with the lack of evidence being used, but also the type, degree, and extent of evidence that's relied on to compare it to. Let's start with what is basically the gold standard. Ancient Egyptian texts. These did meticulously record events like military campaigns and even famines, but there are no references to plagues or, importantly, a mass Israelite exodus. You would think that effectively a catastrophe of this scale would appear in records like the Amarna letters or even temple inscriptions, and the absence is very much notable. There are some arguments, and this is an important weakness to this particular line of evidence, that Egyptians avoided recording defeats and all things that could be considered a divine punishment to maintain their pharaonic prestige. So there's a reason why it's not there, but it also doesn't mean that it is there. You can't take a lack of evidence as proof of anything. It would be kind of like saying that, let's say, because we've destroyed every last sign of the American Civil War, World War I or II, and so on, that those things never happened. We have records to show that they did occur. In this case, it's simply that, well, it's harder to argue that the lack of evidence is actually meaningful, but still it is a weakness to that line of reasoning. It's also no surprise, given that these are the same leaders who built themselves giant stone piles in the shape of a triangle to be remembered in death forever. Then we have chronological issues. Exodus is traditionally dated to somewhere around 1446 BCE. Now, this is based on different, let's say, iterations of the Bible particularly, but various texts over the time. And in some instances, it's also attributed to 1260 BCE, which, again, it's a period of about 200 years. So, in archaeological terms, we're okay. However, there are no Egyptian records from these periods, for example, under Ramses II or Meneptah, which mention plagues, or the sudden loss of a typically largely enslaved Israelite population. There's also the fact that the Meneptah stele from 1208 BCE mentions Israel as a people, not a nation, meaning that even at the time they weren't a significant part of the Egyptian populace. So it seems unlikely that there was a sudden loss of their, well, in this case, enslaved peoples. So if Moses was making a fuss and wanting his people gone, he was talking about a very small percentage of people. There's also some pretty significant archaeological gaps, and we mean significant archaeological gaps. There is no evidence of a large Israelite population, and we are arguably here talking hundreds of thousands of people per Exodus, in either Egypt or the Sinai Desert that has been found to date. The surveys of the Sinai show no trace of mass migration from, well, the periods that would be applicable here. There is no sign, and you would expect there to be a sign, of that many people wandering the desert aimlessly for 40 years, because, well, people make a lot of mess. They leave a lot of crap behind, and there's none of it. And then we have the, lack of the sudden collapse of Egyptian society implied by the plagues, because there's nothing to corroborate it in any archaeological record. In fact, sort of the opposite. It shows that Egypt as a civilization continued reasonably well after the Israelites left, so either they didn't play a major role in society, in which case, why would the pharaoh care if they left, or they just didn't really make much of an impact when they did leave, which means they probably weren't a very large proportion of the population. The 10 plagues are likely a purely theological narrative shaped to an extent by historical and cultural context. They would have certainly been inspired by real environmental and maybe social upheavals, but they would have very much been exaggerated purely for religious purposes. Some supernatural phenomena, for example volcanic eruptions and ecological crises, would explain some of the plagues and, well, the lack of direct Egyptian evidence and the relatively miraculous elements that are suggested are really not going to fit into most historical events in a literal sense. Some scholars argue for a limited historical basis, while others view it as a largely ahistorical book, with the plagues more of a symbolic storytelling of what happened, rather than what really occurred, which sounds more like trying to retrospectively justify what's happened and the fact that your book is bullshit, than actually arguing that it's based on something, which we would at least be able to accept that some of these things have a real-world justification. They're just still nonsense. But this is why and how, for the most part, the early plagues sort of work out in a very awkward way. The latter plagues definitely don't. Thank you for watching this video. If you found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing, and please do post any comments, questions, or suggestions you have below.